The bustling urban neighborhood was alive with energy. The aroma of freshly baked bread wafted from the corner bakery, mingling with the faint sound of a street musician's saxophone. Shopkeepers stood by their entrances, greeting familiar faces and offering friendly nods to newcomers. People hurried along the sidewalk, clutching coffee cups or shopping bags, as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the pavement. Among the crowd, an elderly man stood out, not because of anything flashy, but for his quiet dignity. Mr. Henry Carter, dressed in a simple, slightly weathered coat and worn shoes, leaned on a sturdy wooden cane as he paused near a bus stop. His gray hair was neatly combed, and a calm expression rested on his face, giving him an air of wisdom and composure. To the casual observer, he seemed like any other retiree out for a walk, but there was something about the way he carried himself, something steady and self-assured. Across the street, a police cruiser pulled up, its flashing lights briefly catching the attention of passers-by. From the car stepped Officer Blake, a tall, imposing man with a reputation for being quick-tempered and aggressive. His sharp, cold eyes scanned the area, settling on Mr. Carter. Behind him, Officer Daniels, his younger and more reserved partner, exited the car, adjusting his belt nervously. Daniels always seemed to trail behind Blake, unsure whether to follow his lead or challenge his often abrasive behavior. Blake's gaze hardened as he noticed Mr. Carter standing quietly by the bus stop. "What's he doing just standing there?" he muttered to Daniels. Daniels shrugged, his tone hesitant. "Maybe he's just waiting for the bus," Blake scoffed, already striding across the street. "Waiting for the bus? Dressed like that? Loitering, more like it." As Blake approached, his heavy boots thudding against the pavement, Mr. Carter looked up, his expression unchanging. "Hey, old man," Blake barked. "What are you doing here? Don't you have somewhere else to be?" Mr. Carter met Blake's glare with a calm gaze. "Just waiting for the bus, officer," he said evenly, his voice steady and polite. Blake narrowed his eyes. "You've been standing here for a while. That looks suspicious to me. You sure you're not up to something?" Behind him, Daniels shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the small crowd that had begun to gather. Shopkeepers and pedestrians had paused to watch the interaction, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. "I'm not up to anything," Mr. Carter replied calmly. "Just enjoying the afternoon and minding my own business." Blake's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to people standing their ground, especially not someone who, in his eyes, didn't belong. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "Let me see some ID." Mr. Carter didn't flinch. Slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. Opening it, he handed Blake a state ID card. Blake snatched it, barely glancing at it before shoving it back. "And what about a reason for hanging around here?" "I wasn't aware I needed a reason to wait for a bus," Mr. Carter replied, his tone unchanging. Blake's temper flared. "Don't get cheeky with me, old man," he growled. "I've got better things to do than deal with loiterers." Daniels stepped forward hesitantly. "Blake, maybe we should just let him be. He's not causing any trouble." Blake shot Daniels a sharp look. "Stay out of this," he hissed. By now, the onlookers were openly watching, their murmurs growing louder. Among them was a young woman in her 20s who had begun recording the interaction on her phone. Her brow furrowed as she focused the camera on Blake and Mr. Carter. Blake turned back to Mr. Carter, his frustration boiling over. "You think you can just stand there and talk back to me?" he snapped, stepping closer. "I didn't realize answering your questions was talking back," Mr. Carter said evenly, meeting Blake's glare. Blake's patience snapped. In a fit of anger, he kicked Mr. Carter's cane, knocking it out of his hand. Mr. Carter stumbled but managed to steady himself, his calm expression finally giving way to a flicker of disbelief. The crowd gasped audibly. "What's wrong with you?" someone called out. The young woman with the phone moved closer, her voice trembling with anger. "You can't do that. He's done nothing wrong." Blake turned to the crowd, his face reddening. "Mind your own business," he barked. But the damage was done. The crowd wasn't dispersing. They were growing larger, their murmurs turning to angry whispers. Mr. Carter straightened, his composure returning. "You really don't know who I am, do you?" he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough weight to silence the crowd's murmurs. Blake smirked, though there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "Oh, and who exactly are you?" Mr. Carter didn't answer immediately. Instead, he bent down to pick up his cane, his movements slow and deliberate. Straightening, he met Blake's gaze and said calmly, "You'll find out soon enough." The tension in the air was palpable. Blake's smirk faltered as Mr. Carter reached into his coat pocket again, this time pulling out a sleek phone. With a calm expression, he dialed a number and held the phone to his ear. "Looks like you've crossed a line," Mr. Carter said into the phone. His voice was steady, but there was an undertone of authority that made even the onlookers pause. The crowd exchanged glances, their whispers growing louder. "Who is he?" someone murmured. "Why is he so calm?" Blake's confidence began to waver. Daniels, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stepped closer to his partner. "Blake," he said quietly, "maybe we should back off." Blake ignored him, his gaze fixed on Mr. Carter. "Go ahead," he sneered. "Call whoever you want, it won't make a difference." But as Mr. Carter ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, there was a faint smile on his lips, a smile that seemed to hold the promise of a revelation that would change everything. The crowd held its breath, the tension hanging in the air like a storm about to break. And as Mr. Carter stood tall, his calm gaze never wavering, one question lingered in everyone's minds. Who was this man? Really? The soft hum of the suburban neighborhood carried on as the old man adjusted his cap, pulling it low over his weathered face. Samuel Henderson, a retired FBI agent who had spent decades fighting crime, now preferred the quiet life. But his sharp eyes, once scanning high-profile criminals, now watched over his peaceful community. Today, however, his quiet demeanor was about to clash with a volatile force. Samuel had taken his usual route to the park, a short walk, past trimmed hedges and blooming gardens. Despite his aged body, he carried himself with dignity. His navy blue windbreaker bore no sign of his illustrious career, nor did the simple leather shoes he wore. To any casual observer, he was just another senior enjoying his golden years. The park, alive with the chatter of children and the chirping of birds, seemed the perfect place for Samuel to relax. He settled on a bench, the gentle sun warming his face as he unfolded a newspaper. The articles barely caught his attention. He was more attuned to the dynamics of his environment, a skill honed over decades in law enforcement. Nearby, 2 police officers exited their squad car. Officer Trent, a burly figure with a constant scowl, led the way, followed by Officer Davis, a younger recruit who seemed uneasy. The 2 were responding to a call about a suspicious person loitering in the park. A report made by a vigilant neighbor who mistook Samuel's harmless presence for something more sinister. "Let's check this out," Trent muttered, his tone heavy with disdain. As they approached, Trent's eyes fixed on Samuel. His mind made quick judgments based on the old man's casual attire and the simple bag resting beside him. To Trent, Samuel didn't belong in this pristine suburban setting. "Sir," Trent barked, his voice startling the nearby birds into flight. "What are you doing here?" Samuel looked up, his calm eyes meeting Trent's aggressive glare. "Just reading the paper," he replied evenly. Trent's scowl deepened. "This is private property. Residents have reported suspicious activity. Do you live around here?" Samuel's eyebrows arched slightly. "Suspicious activity?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. "I've lived in this neighborhood for years. Is there a problem?" Davis shifted uncomfortably behind Trent. His gaze flickered between the two men, sensing the brewing tension. "Do you have ID?" Trent demanded, his hand resting on his belt. The gesture wasn't lost on Samuel, who had spent a lifetime observing the subtleties of body language. Samuel sighed and reached into his jacket. "I don't see why this is necessary," he said, pulling out his wallet. Trent snatched the ID, his eyes narrowing as he scanned it. "Henderson," he read aloud, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Never heard of you." "You wouldn't have," Samuel replied dryly. "I'm not exactly famous." Trent's jaw tightened. "What's in the bag?" he asked, pointing to Samuel's belongings. Samuel glanced at the bag and then back at Trent. "Just some snacks and a water bottle. You're welcome to take a look." The challenge in Samuel's tone didn't go unnoticed. Trent stepped forward and kicked the bag over, scattering its contents across the ground. A bottle rolled to the side, while a neatly packed sandwich landed near Samuel's feet. Gasps from nearby onlookers rippled through the park. Davis's face paled. "Trent," he whispered urgently. "Maybe we should—" "Quiet, Davis," Trent snapped. "I know what I'm doing." Samuel remained seated, his composure unshaken. "Was that necessary?" he asked, his voice calm but with an undercurrent of authority. Trent sneered. "We take every precaution to ensure this neighborhood stays safe." "Safe from what?" Samuel asked, rising to his feet. Though his movements were slow, his presence seemed to tower over Trent. "From an old man reading a newspaper?" Trent bristled at the quiet challenge. "Don't get smart with me," he growled. "People like you think you can do whatever you want." "People like me?" Samuel repeated, his tone sharp. "And what kind of person would that be, Officer Trent?" The growing crowd of parkgoers watched the exchange with increasing unease. Murmurs spread as they recognized the escalating tension. A young woman discreetly raised her phone, recording the interaction. Nearby, a father pulled his child closer, his eyes locked on the scene. Trent ignored the murmurs, his focus solely on Samuel. "You think you're untouchable?" he snapped. "Well, guess what? I'm the law here." Davis stepped forward, his voice firm but tentative. "Trent, let's de-escalate," he urged. "There's no threat here." Trent shot him a glare. "Back off, Davis. I've got this." Samuel's gaze shifted to Davis, his sharp instincts catching the young officer's discomfort. "You seem like a reasonable man," Samuel said to Davis. "Do you agree with this behavior?" Davis hesitated, his internal conflict evident. He began, but Trent cut him off. "That's enough," Trent barked. He stepped closer to Samuel, his chest puffed out. "You want to play games, old man? Let's see how you handle spending a night in jail." The crowd gasped audibly as Trent reached for his handcuffs. Samuel didn't flinch. Instead, he raised a hand, his voice steady but commanding. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The weight of Samuel's tone momentarily froze Trent. The retired agent's eyes bore into him, filled with a lifetime of experience that Trent couldn't begin to fathom. "What are you, some kind of tough guy?" Trent sneered, though his bravado wavered. Samuel smiled faintly. "Something like that." The standoff was broken by the sudden arrival of a third figure, a woman in her late 30s dressed in professional attire, strode into the scene with purpose. Her confident demeanor and piercing gaze immediately commanded attention. "Is there a problem here?" she asked, her voice crisp and authoritative. Trent turned to her, his irritation clear. "Who are you?" The woman pulled out a badge, flashing it briefly before slipping it back into her pocket. "I'm Agent Monica Alvarez, FBI," she said coolly, "and you're about to have a very bad day." The crowd erupted into murmurs as Trent's face turned ashen. Davis's eyes widened, realization dawning on him. "Agent Alvarez," Samuel greeted, his tone lighter now. "Good timing." "Always happy to assist, sir," she replied with a faint smile. She turned her attention to Trent, her expression hardening. "Do you have any idea who you've been harassing?" Trent stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating. I was just following protocol," he said weakly. "Protocol?" Alvarez repeated, her voice cutting. "You've been threatening and humiliating a retired FBI agent, a man who's dedicated his life to serving this country." The weight of her words hit Trent like a sledgehammer. He stumbled backward, his face pale. Samuel stepped forward, his calm demeanor returning. "You wanted to know who I am, Officer Trent," he said evenly. "I'm Samuel Henderson, retired special agent with the FBI, and if you had done your job properly, you would have known that before trying to arrest me." The crowd erupted into applause, their earlier unease transforming into admiration for Samuel. Phones recorded every moment, ensuring the incident would reach far beyond the park. Trent stood frozen, his mind racing as he realized the gravity of his actions. Davis stepped forward, his expression apologetic. "Mr. Henderson," he said, his voice sincere, "I'm sorry for what happened today. This isn't how things should be." Samuel nodded, his gaze softening. "Apology accepted," he said, "but let this be a lesson to both of you. Respect is not optional." Alvarez turned to the crowd, addressing them directly. "Let this serve as a reminder that no one is above the law, not even those tasked with enforcing it." The crowd cheered, their voices carrying a message of accountability and justice. As the tension dissipated, Samuel bent down to gather his scattered belongings, his composure unshaken. Davis stepped forward to help, his hands trembling slightly. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for showing me what it means to stand tall." Samuel offered a faint smile. "It's never too late to learn." As Samuel and Alvarez walked away, the crowd parted to let them pass. Trent remained rooted in place, his arrogance shattered and his reputation in tatters. The whispers and judgmental glances of the onlookers weighed heavily on him. For Samuel, the incident was just another chapter in a life defined by resilience and integrity. For Trent, it was a reckoning he would never forget. And for the crowd, it was a powerful reminder of the value of respect and the importance of standing up for what's right. The station's atmosphere had shifted from the moment Mr. Johnson stepped inside, though the officers only now seemed to realize it. As Officer Miller paced the room, his earlier arrogance began to falter. Something about Johnson's presence unnerved him in a way he couldn't quite place. The older man had an aura of unshakable calm, an impenetrable poise that left Miller questioning himself. Miller wasn't used to being challenged. Not like this. He was used to exerting authority, demanding respect. But this man, sitting so serenely on the bench, seemed to hold all the power without uttering a single word. Miller's partner, Officer Davis, couldn't hide his unease. He'd spent the last few minutes scrolling through his phone, his expression growing more tense with every swipe. What he'd uncovered about Johnson was extraordinary, but Davis couldn't decide whether sharing it with Miller would make things better or worse. He glanced at Johnson again. The older man remained perfectly still, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the officers, as if silently gauging their next move. It was as though Johnson was in control of the room, despite being ostensibly at the mercy of the law. Miller finally stopped pacing and approached Johnson with renewed determination, his voice laced with thinly veiled frustration. "All right, Mr. Johnson, let's cut the act. Why don't you just tell us what you're really doing here?" Johnson looked up slowly, his gaze meeting Miller's with a calm intensity. "I believe I've already told you," he said evenly. "I was walking." Miller leaned in, his tone hardening. "And you expect me to believe that? A man like you, dressed like that, just strolling through this neighborhood for no reason?" Johnson's faint smile didn't waver. "And what reason should I have needed? Last I checked, walking wasn't a crime." The answer caught Miller off guard. For a moment he struggled to formulate a response. "It's not a crime," he said finally. "But let's just say you don't exactly fit the profile of someone who belongs here?" Johnson tilted his head, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "And what, officer, does that profile look like?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Davis shifted uncomfortably in the background, feeling the weight of Johnson's words. Miller hesitated, realizing he was treading dangerous ground. "You know what I mean," he said, his tone defensive. "No, I don't think I do," Johnson replied, his voice calm but unyielding. "Why don't you explain it to me?" Miller opened his mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. He turned away abruptly, muttering something under his breath. Johnson remained seated, his expression unreadable. Outside the station, the crowd that had gathered earlier was growing. Word of the incident was spreading fast, with passers-by stopping to record video clips and share updates on social media. The buzz wasn't just about the altercation anymore, it was about the man at the center of it. Rumors were beginning to swirl about his identity, fueled by snippets of overheard conversation and speculative whispers. Back inside, Davis couldn't keep quiet any longer. He pulled Miller aside, his voice low but urgent. "We need to talk," he said, showing Miller his phone. The screen displayed an article with a headline that made Miller's stomach drop. Charles Chuck Johnson, retired FBI agent, decorated national hero. The accompanying photo left no doubt. It was the same man sitting calmly in their station. Miller's face paled as he scanned the article. "This has to be a mistake," he muttered. "He can't be that guy." Davis shook his head. "It's no mistake, Miller. That's him. The man who took down some of the biggest crime syndicates in the country. He's a legend." Miller's grip on the phone tightened. "If that's true," he said, his voice shaky, "then why is he here? Why didn't he just tell us who he was?" "Maybe because he shouldn't have to," Davis replied, his tone pointed. "Maybe he wanted to see how we'd treat him without knowing." Miller stared at Davis, the weight of the situation sinking in. He'd thought he was dealing with an ordinary man, a nobody who could be intimidated and dismissed. But this was Charles Johnson, a man who had spent decades uncovering corruption and dismantling organized crime. And now, Miller realized, he was the one being judged. When the two officers re-entered the room, Johnson looked up, his expression unchanged. Miller hesitated, unsure how to proceed. "Mr. Johnson," he began, his voice quieter than before, "it seems we might have misunderstood the situation." Johnson raised an eyebrow. "Is that so?" Miller cleared his throat. We didn't realize who you were." "And now that you do?" Johnson asked, his tone carrying a subtle challenge. Miller faltered, his confidence eroding further. "Now, we'd just like to, clear up any misunderstanding." Johnson leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharp. The misunderstanding, officer, isn't about who I am. It's about who you assumed I wasn't." The words cut deep, and Miller felt a flush of shame creeping up his neck. He glanced at Davis, who looked equally uncomfortable but didn't intervene. Johnson stood slowly, his movements deliberate. Though he wasn't a physically imposing man, his presence filled the room. "What you fail to understand," Johnson said, his voice steady, "is that your assumptions have consequences. They affect how you see people, how you treat them, and how you carry out your duty. Today, you saw a man who didn't fit your expectations, and you decided he was a problem to be dealt with. But what if I weren't Charles Johnson? What if I were just an ordinary man walking through this neighborhood? Would my humanity have mattered less to you?" Miller didn't respond. He couldn't. The weight of Johnson's words rendered him speechless. Outside, the murmur of the crowd grew louder as reporters and news cameras arrived, drawn by the escalating buzz on social media. Davis stepped forward, his voice shaky but sincere. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "I just want to say, I'm sorry. For everything." Johnson regarded him for a moment, his expression softening slightly. "Apology accepted," he said. "But remember, an apology is only meaningful if it's followed by action." Davis nodded, his resolve firm. Miller, meanwhile, remained frozen, grappling with the realization that his actions had been not only unprofessional, but deeply wrong. Johnson walked past them, his steps unhurried, and exited the room. As he stepped outside, the crowd erupted into applause. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but Johnson merely raised a hand in acknowledgement before continuing on his way. For Miller, the incident was a turning point, a stark reminder of the power and responsibility that came with his badge. For Davis, it was a lesson in courage and integrity, one he vowed never to forget. And for Charles Johnson, it was another step in his ongoing mission to challenge assumptions, confront prejudice, and inspire change. The crowd watched him go, their voices filled with admiration and awe. But one question lingered in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. How many more Charles Johnsons would it take for the world to finally learn? Here's the continuation of the story for the next section. The next day, the fallout from the incident began to ripple through the community and beyond. News outlets had picked up the story overnight, their headlines screaming with outrage and intrigue. Retired FBI agent mistakenly harassed by local police. Decorated war hero challenges racial bias. And Charles Johnson, from national hero to target of prejudice. Social media was abuzz with hashtags calling for justice, accountability, and broader conversations about systemic bias. At the precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Officer Miller sat at his desk, his head in his hands. The guilt he'd managed to push aside the previous day now consumed him entirely. He avoided his colleagues' eyes, knowing they'd seen the videos circulating online, videos that didn't paint him in the best light. He replayed the incident in his mind, wishing he could rewrite every moment. Officer Davis, meanwhile, scrolled through his phone, reading the growing number of comments and posts about the incident. Most were supportive of Johnson, lauding his calm demeanor and sharp wit. Others were critical of the police, highlighting the biases and assumptions that had led to the altercation. Davis felt torn. He had tried to speak up, but had he done enough? Across town, Johnson sat in a modest cafe, sipping a cup of tea as he watched the news coverage on a small television mounted on the wall. The footage showed snippets of the confrontation, Miller's pointed questions, Johnson's calm responses, the growing crowd outside the station. The broadcasters emphasized Johnson's storied career, recounting his years in the FBI and the numerous lives he'd impacted through his work. A young woman approached Johnson cautiously, her hands trembling slightly as she held out her phone. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft. "Are you Mr. Johnson?" Johnson looked up and offered her a warm smile. "I am," he said. She hesitated before continuing. I saw the video, and I wanted to thank you for staying so calm, for standing up for what's right. My brother, he went through something similar, but he didn't have your strength." Johnson's expression softened. "I'm sorry your brother experienced that," he said. "But strength isn't something that only some of us have. It's something we all carry, even if we don't always realize it." The young woman nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, before turning to leave. As Johnson watched her go, his phone buzzed on the table. It was a call from an old friend and former colleague, Marcus Reed. Reed had been Johnson's partner during their years in the FBI, and though they'd both retired, they kept in touch regularly. "Chuck," Reed said when Johnson answered, "I saw the news. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Johnson replied. "Better than fine, actually." Reed let out a low chuckle. "You've always been better under pressure than anyone I've ever known. But this is big, Chuck. You're in the spotlight again, and not just for your work. People are talking about you in ways they haven't before." Johnson sighed. "I didn't ask for this spotlight, Marcus, but if it's here, maybe we can use it to make a difference." "You've always been good at that," Reed said. "But be careful. Not everyone will want to hear what you have to say." "I know," Johnson replied. "But that's never stopped me before." Back at the precinct, the tension reached a boiling point when the chief of police called an emergency meeting. The officers gathered in the briefing room, their expressions ranging from anxious to indifferent. Miller sat near the back, his posture slouched and his face pale. The chief stood at the front, his arms crossed as he addressed the room. "I'm sure you've all seen the news by now," he began, his tone serious. "This department is under scrutiny, and not just because of yesterday's incident. This is about something bigger: how we conduct ourselves, how we treat the people we're sworn to protect, and the biases we bring into this uniform." The chief's gaze swept across the room, lingering on Miller for a moment before continuing. "I've spoken to Mr. Johnson personally," he said, "and while he's not pressing charges, he's made it clear that changes need to be made, not just here, but everywhere." Miller's head shot up at the mention of Johnson's name. The idea that the man he'd humiliated had opted for leniency instead of retribution only deepened his shame. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. After the meeting, Davis found Miller sitting alone in the break room. He hesitated before approaching, unsure of how to navigate the tension between them. Finally, he sat down across from Miller and broke the silence. "You need to make this right," Davis said bluntly. Miller glanced at him, his eyes hollow. "How? What can I possibly do to fix this?" "You start by owning up to what you did," Davis replied. "Not just to the chief, but to Johnson, and to yourself." Miller exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't even know if he'll talk to me," he muttered. "Maybe not," Davis said, "but you owe him the effort." That evening, Miller found himself standing outside the cafe where Johnson was known to frequent. He hesitated before stepping inside, his heart pounding in his chest. When he spotted Johnson seated at a corner table, he froze, unsure of how to proceed. Johnson noticed him almost immediately and gestured for him to come over. Miller approached slowly, his hands clenched at his sides. "Mr. Johnson," he began, his voice trembling. I came to apologize for everything. For how I treated you, for the assumptions I made, for the disrespect I showed." Johnson regarded him quietly for a moment before nodding. "I appreciate your apology," he said. "But the real question is, what are you going to do differently?" Miller swallowed hard, the weight of the question sinking in. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I want to learn. I want to be better." Johnson's expression softened. "That's a start," he said. "The first step toward change is acknowledging where you went wrong. The next step is action." Miller nodded, his resolve firming. "I'll do better," he said. "I promise." As Miller left the cafe, he felt a strange sense of relief. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt capable of walking it. For Johnson, the day was another reminder of the power of dialogue and accountability. As he sipped his tea and watched the sunset over the city, he knew that the fight for justice and equality was far from over. But he also knew that change, however slow, was possible. And for those who had witnessed the events of the past 2 days, Johnson's words and actions would serve as a lasting reminder that the value of a person could never be measured by assumptions, and that true strength lay in kindness, understanding, and the courage to confront one's own flaws. The fallout from the cafe incident reverberated throughout the community, with conversations about systemic injustice taking center stage. The story of Charles Johnson's encounter with Officer Miller had gone viral, sparking national outrage and introspection. Johnson, however, remained composed amidst the storm, focusing his efforts on turning the moment into an opportunity for meaningful change. The buzz of media attention was relentless. Reporters camped outside Johnson's modest home, and his phone rang incessantly with calls from journalists, activists, and old colleagues offering their support or seeking his insight. Johnson's calm demeanor never wavered as he prepared for the next steps. One morning, as he sipped coffee on his porch, Johnson received a call from Angela Thompson, a renowned civil rights attorney and longtime friend. "Charles," she began, her voice steady but tinged with urgency, "this is more than just a viral moment. It's a chance to create lasting change." "What's on your mind, Angela?" Johnson asked, leaning back in his chair. "A community forum," Angela replied. "Bring together law enforcement, civic leaders, and citizens for an open dialogue. No grandstanding or rehearsed speeches, just honest, raw conversations about what's broken and how we fix it." Johnson considered the proposal, nodding to himself. "It could work," he said, "but we'll need to ensure it's a safe space for everyone, even those who've made mistakes." "That's why we need you to lead it," Angela said. "People trust you, Charles. They see you as someone who's lived through it and come out stronger. If you're there, they'll listen." The following week, preparations for the forum were in full swing. Flyers were distributed throughout the neighborhood, local radio stations amplified the message, and social media was abuzz with anticipation. The venue, a local community center, quickly filled to capacity on the day of the event. The audience was a tapestry of the town's diversity: students, parents, retirees, business owners, and uniformed officers, including Miller and Davis. Miller, seated near the back, shifted uneasily in his chair. The week since the incident had been a whirlwind of self-reflection and mounting guilt. His pride had taken a back seat as he wrestled with the implications of his actions. Beside him, Davis offered a reassuring pat on the shoulder, silently encouraging him to stay the course. As Johnson took the stage, the room fell silent. He scanned the crowd, his gaze steady and thoughtful, before speaking. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "The incident last week wasn't unique. It was just one chapter in a much larger story, a story many of you know all too well." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "But today isn't about assigning blame. It's about understanding. It's about listening, learning, and building something better together. The first speaker was Elijah, a young black man who shared a harrowing account of being wrongfully stopped and frisked while walking home from work. His voice trembled as he described the humiliation and fear he felt, but his words carried a poignant message of resilience. Next, a middle-aged woman recounted her worries for her teenage son. "Every time he leaves the house, I pray he comes back safe," she said, her voice breaking. No mother should live with that kind of fear. As the stories unfolded, the atmosphere grew heavier with emotion. Then, Officer Davis approached the microphone. His usual stoicism was replaced by vulnerability as he acknowledged the system he had witnessed and his own complicity in them. "I've been silent too long," Davis admitted, "and silence isn't neutral. It's a choice that enables harm. I don't want to be that person anymore." His words were met with quiet nods of approval, but the room tensed when Miller stepped forward. The crowd's skepticism was palpable as he took the microphone. "My name is Officer Miller," he began, his voice tight with emotion, "and I was the officer who disrespected Charles Johnson." The room buzzed with murmurs, but Miller raised a hand to quiet the crowd. "I'm not here to make excuses," he continued. "What I did was wrong, and I take full responsibility for my actions. To Mr. Johnson, and to all of you, I am deeply sorry." The room fell silent, the weight of Miller's admission hanging heavily in the air. He pressed on, his voice steadier now. "The past week has forced me to confront parts of myself I didn't want to see. I've learned that being a good officer isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about serving with humility and respect." Miller stepped back, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure how his words would be received, but he knew they needed to be said. Johnson approached him, placing a firm yet gentle hand on his shoulder. "Accountability is the first step toward change," Johnson said, addressing the audience. "But it's just the beginning. Change happens when we commit to doing better, not alone, but together." The crowd erupted into applause, a mix of relief and hope resonating throughout the room. The forum continued for hours, with heartfelt discussions, difficult questions, and a collective determination to forge a path forward. By the end of the evening, the forum had achieved something remarkable. It had laid bare the wounds of the community while sowing the seeds of healing. For Johnson, it was a testament to the power of dialogue, empathy, and shared humanity. As the attendees filtered out, many stopped to shake Johnson's hand or express their gratitude. Miller lingered near the back, his expression reflective. Davis approached him, offering a small smile. "Proud of you," Davis said. "Took guts to say what you did." Miller nodded, his gaze distant. "I just hope it makes a difference." "It already has," Davis replied. Later that night, Johnson sat in his quiet living room reflecting on the day. His phone buzzed with messages of support and gratitude, but one stood out. It was from Miller. "Thank you for giving me a chance to be better. I won't waste it." Johnson smiled faintly, his faith in humanity reaffirmed. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but moments like these reminded him that change was always possible, even in the most unlikely places. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful and thought-provoking stories. Join the conversation in the comments below. What would you do in this situation? Let's spread the message of kindness, justice, and understanding. See you in the next one.